Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Are you finding your seats? A very warm welcome. I have the difficult job of pulling people in after lunch and breaking off the excellent conversation that was going on upstairs. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. I'm director of Chatham House, in case we haven't met. And I just want to say a very few words before handing over to Lina Khattab in this wonderful panel to discuss a climate emergency facing Iraq. One of the things I want to say is just how proud we are of this initiative, which has been now in its 4th year. And I want to give a particular thanks to Crescent Petroleum and the Al-Swedi family for making it possible to have this gathering. And I'm proud of everything we do at Chatham House, but this is one of the prime things we do, of bringing together so many people really focused on the practical questions of what can be improved, even in difficult circumstances. We're doing it, some of these conversations in private, some of them in public, and that is the heart of what Chatham House does. Some things under the famous rule and some things reaching out, wanting the attention of many people. Well, this is, I'm not going to delay this discussion anymore, but just to say this is really a heartfelt welcome. I am fiercely proud of this particular gathering, and I refer to it more times than you might imagine when I'm called on to describe all the things that Chatham House does. So great to have you all here today. And Lina, I'm going to hand over to you now for this excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and welcome back. This is our session on addressing Iraq's climate emergency. I'm Lina Khattab. I'm an associate fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, and I'm also the director of the SOAS Middle East Institute. It's a pleasure to be here. This session is going to be mostly in English, apart from, I think, one speaker who's going to speak in Arabic, but you know the drill, there's translation. And I'm just going to introduce the speakers very briefly, because everyone has their bios already, and the same rules apply. This is a conference that's being live streamed. It's on the record. Please feel free to tweet using the hashtag Iraq Initiative. The session can also will be available for those who aren't able to be with us here today afterwards. And for anyone joining us on Zoom, you can submit questions to us through the Q&A function. So I'm really delighted. It's a very important topic, especially that COP28 is around the corner. The issue of climate challenges in the region, especially in Iraq, is not going away. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Shukri Al-Hassan, who is an environmentalist and academic from the University of Basra. Those of you who follow the climate issues in Iraq will know that Basra is at the heart of, unfortunately, challenges facing Iraq in that regard. Next to him is Greg Shapland, who is a writer and researcher on politics, security, resources, and the environment in the Middle East and North Africa, currently a senior visiting fellow at the LSE. Then we have my colleague Gleda Lan, who's a senior research fellow at Chatham House with the Environment and Society Center. And last but not least, joining us online is Dr. Farid Yassin, who is the climate envoy of the Republic of Iraq and advisor to the Prime Minister on climate change and sustainable development. We're going to start with a bit of a diagnosis of the challenges. As I mentioned, Basra is sadly at the heart of this. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Al-Hassan and ask about Basra in particular and the challenges faced there in terms of climate issues. Over to you.
شكرا جزيلا وشكرا لشاتم هاوس على الدعوة الكريمة لحضوري لهذا المؤتمر. منذ 25 سنة وأنا أراقب الوضع البيئي في البصرة بشكل خاص وفي العراق بشكل عام. وأستطيع القول بأنني شاهد عيان على كل التغيرات والتحولات العميقة اللي حدثت في البيئة العراقية. وبحوزة كثير من البيانات والشواهد اللي تؤكد اتجاه البيئة في البصرة بشكل خاص نحو التدهور. في الحقيقة البصرة لها خصوصية في الاهتمام البيئي لأنها تمثل الثقل الاقتصادي والسكاني كبير في العراق. فيها أكبر حقول النفط في العالم، فيها يقطنها حوالي أكثر من 4 ملايين نسمة، ولكن البصرة شهدت تراجع في نوعية البيئة بشكل خاص، وهذا التراجع هو نتيجة لتضافر التغير المناخي مع الأفعال البشرية السيئة. في البصرة يحدث نوع من الدورة المهلكة، ما أستطيع أن أسميه بالدورة المهلكة، اللي هي تبدأ بأنه البشر يؤثرون بشكل سلبي في المناخ، فالمناخ نتيجة التغير اللي يحصل فيه يؤثر على السكان بدوره، وتكون الاستجابات سلبية لهذا التغير المناخي، ومن ثم تنعكس على المناخ نفسه، وهكذا ندخل في هذه الحلقة المفرغة. أستطيع أنه أختصر أبرز ملامح التغير البيئي اللي جات تشهده البصرة في الوقت الحاضر بما يلي. رقم 1، في الحقيقة هنالك عندنا ارتفاع في درجات الحرارة الصغرى أصبح في البصرة، وازداد تكرار درجات الحرارة الخمسينية بشكل ملحوظ خلال 20 سنة الأخيرة. أصبح الصيف أكثر طولا، وأصبح الشتاء أقصر، فيما اختفى فصلي الربيع والخريف من هذه المنطقة. لدينا انحسار ملحوظ في كمية الأمطار خصوصا في أشهر شباط وآذار ونيسان. لدينا كمية هائلة من التبخر تعادل تقريبا 8 مليار متر مكعب في السنة، وهذه الكمية كفيلة بأنه تنسف نصف الخزين المائي العراقي في السنة الواحدة. لدينا أيضا أصبح تكرار وزيادة في تكرار الغبار المتصاعد بشكل كبير جدا. بالحقيقة هذا التفاعل المدمر ما بين التغير المناخي وما بين الاستجابات البشرية أدى إلى خسائر جسيمة في بيئة البصرة. فمثلا فقدنا غابات النخيل. البصرة كانت تحتوي على أكبر غابة نخيل في العالم، من 15 مليون نخلة إلى حاليا تقريبا عندنا بحدود 2 مليون نخلة. نعم صحيح غابات النخيل انفقدت بسبب الحرب العراقية الإيرانية والعمليات العسكرية اللي جرت، ولكن التغير المناخي اللي صار في البصرة منع عودة زراعة النخيل مرة أخرى إلى هذه المدينة. خسرنا حوالي 30% من الأراضي الزراعية اللي موجودة في البصرة لحساب التصحر. حدث عندنا انكماش في مساحة المسطحات المائية بحدود 45% عما كانت عليه قبل 40 سنة. شط العرب اللي هو شريان الحياة في البصرة فقد تقريبا 65% من الواردات المائية اللي كانت تجي في السابق أو خلال 25 سنة الماضية. هذا ناهيك عن حصول خسارات كثيرة في التنوع الأحيائي وفقدان كثير من الأحياء. الشيء الخطير الجديد في البصرة هو مشكلة التلوث، وهنا يلعب المناخ دورا في تغذية التلوث، وفي المقابل التلوث يعزز من التغير المناخي. كيف يحصل ذلك؟ دعوني أضرب لكم مثالين. المثال الأول هو أزمة المياه اللي حصلت في البصرة في عام 2018. في الحقيقة السبب الجذري لها هو التغير المناخي. لو بحثنا بعمق لوجدنا أن التغير المناخي هو السبب. هذا ما نعنيه بأنه التغير المناخي هو يعزز من التلوث. المثال المقابل الآخر أنه التلوث يعزز أيضا من التغير المناخي. فمثلا الانبعاثات الغازية الهائلة اللي تطرح من حقول النفط في البصرة حاليا هذه تغذي من المشكلة وتعزز من عملية التغير المناخي. مثلا البصرة مصدر مهم لانبعاثات الميثان. دعوني هنا أريكم شيئا. هذه سحابة ميثان من البصرة، اعتبرت بأكبر سحابة ميثان انطلقت في العالم في يوم واحد في عام 2020. 120 طن أطلقت سحابة من الميثان. هذه صورة من المعهد الهولندي لأبحاث الفضاء، وسمحت لي البي بي سي بعرضها في هذا المؤتمر. ما أريد أن أقول في الأخير أنه الانبعاثات الغازية الكربونية في البصرة تقريبا أكثر من 700 فلير يبعث بالدخان. هي لا تغذي الاحترار العالمي فحسب، بل إنها تؤدي إلى قتل الأطفال وإيذاء الناس. استطعنا من خلال العمل الاستقصائي مع قناة البي بي سي أنه نثبت أنه الانبعاثات الغازية في البصرة هي مسؤولة عن سرطان الأطفال، واستطعنا أن نربط العلاقة ما بينهما، ولعل هذا المرتسم يوضح لنا العلاقة ما بين كميات النفثول اللي موجودة في أجساد الأطفال وما بين الانبعاثات الغازية اللي موجودة في الجو. استطعنا أن نثبت هذه العلاقة التي كان يشكك فيها الكثيرين. هذا العمل هو للفيلم الوثائقي تحت سماء سامة أقامت به البي بي سي. وأيضا لدينا في جامعة البصرة حاليا دراسة نعمل عليها، نحاول فيها أنه نثبت تأثير التلوث النفطي على حالات الإجهاض والتشوهات الولادية والعقم التي تصيب النساء، ونحن في طور إنجاز هذه الدراسة. أكتفي بهذا القدر. شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا. Next, I'd like to turn to my colleague Greg. The issue of water has come up in the discussion we just heard. And you've done a lot of work on water and recently published a report for the UK's Foreign Office on Iraq's water security, of course, including the impact of climate change. So, Greg, over to you about main findings and perhaps some policy recommendations from your work.
Thank you, Lina. Yes, my research looked at water security in Iraq in the light of climate impacts, but also a number of other factors. So, as to my main findings, first, Iraq already suffers from poor water security. This is partly due to the consumption of water by Turkey and Iran from the rivers which they share with Iraq. Thanks. And we should bear in mind that around 60% of the flow of Iraq's rivers comes from its upstream neighbours. But Iraqis can't just blame others for the water scarcity they experience. Iraq doesn't use the water it does have efficiently. There's a lot that Iraq could do to improve its water security, and I'll come on to that later. But if these things aren't done, climate change, population growth, and so on will make the situation a good deal worse than it is today. Turkey is planning to build more dams. Similarly, Iraq shows no sign of stopping its dam building and water transfer schemes either, although it's much less open about its plans than Turkey is. So flow in the rivers which Iraq shares with its upstream neighbours is set to decline even more. And the quality of water in these shared rivers, especially the Euphrates, has also fallen and is almost certain to fall still further. In all of this, Syria's future consumption of water from shared rivers is a known unknown, but population growth and reconstruction in Syria, when it happens, are going to ensure that Syria takes more water than it is doing today. In coming years, Two other factors will almost certainly make Iraq's water security more precarious. One is increased demand within Iraq, a function of growing population, post-conflict reconstruction, and economic development more generally. The other is climate change, which projections suggest will significantly reduce water flows in the Tigris-Euphrates river system. And it's worth remarking that the projections derived from different climate models give quite similar results for the Tigris-Euphrates river system, which is unusual in the climate change projection business, at least at the regional rather than the global scale. Now, very briefly, these models suggest that by the middle of this century, which was the time horizon I took for this report, there will be less rain and snow over the mountains of eastern Turkey and southwestern Iran, plus even higher variability from year to year. As a consequence, there will be significantly reduced flows in both rivers and their tributaries, and higher temperatures will mean more water will be lost to evaporation from lakes, reservoirs, and irrigation canals, and plants grown in Iraq will need more irrigation per ton of output. Now, a report produced for Iraq's Ministry of Water Resources in 2015 suggests that by 2035, the gap between demand and supply will have reached almost 11 billion cubic meters of water a year in Iraq, which is around 20% of its present water budget. And one otherwise sober academic article describes the future of, I quote, agriculture and human conditions in Iraq in the 21st century as, quote, very dark and gloomy. As I've already said, Iraq's present lack of water security is mainly a function of factors other than climate change, but climate change will become a more and more important element of the equation as time goes on. Other things, though, will be at least as important. One of these is that the Tigris-Euphrates river system is a highly engineered or highly regulated system. In other words, there are lots of dams and diversion works. So how Turkey, Iran, and Syria operate their dams, especially in years of low flow, will determine how much water Iraq gets. Iraq, it seems, has next to no ability to influence how Turkey, Iran, and Syria operate their dams. This unhappy state of affairs reflects the weakness of Iraq's position vis-à-vis both Turkey and Iran. It's downstream of both countries on the Tigris and Euphrates and is a good deal weaker militarily than they are. Iranian influence over many of Iraq's political parties and militias means that Baghdad is incapable of standing up to Tehran over Iran's unbridled use of shared water resources. Moreover, Iraq appears to have little to offer either country to persuade them to adopt a more understanding attitude or to enter into negotiations on permanent agreements, which is something we might take up later, because it's strange that that's the case. Of these two powerful upstream neighbors, Turkey and Iran, Turkey has at least shown some willingness to respond to requests from Baghdad for more water at times of shortage in Iraq. Iraqi ministers have had exchanges with Iranian counterparts about water, but these exchanges seem to have, do not seem to have made any difference to flows from Iran into Iraq. Iran takes the water it needs, and Iraq can have what's left, if there is anything left, that is. Quite apart from the power imbalances between Turkey and Iraq, and Iran and Iraq, Iraq's position is weakened by the absence of an agreed legal regime covering the whole basin. No negotiations aimed at establishing such a regime are presently in prospect. There are bilateral agreements between Turkey and Iraq and Syria and Iraq, but these don't meet present needs. For example, they say nothing about water quality, and they were signed before the threat from climate change became clear. So, despite these formidable problems, there are many things which Iraq could do to improve its water situation. I've recommended a few in my report. In my report, I stayed very much at the modest end of the scale because the more aspirational ideas that I've seen in other reports seem to me unrealistic. But as far as the FCDO is concerned, it could perhaps provide small-scale dispersed assistance to farmers. It could provide assistance to farmers to help them grow drought and heat-resistant crops. It could engage in initiatives relating to groundwater, which is much neglected. There's a need to improve the capacity of officials, Iraqi officials, both in the Ministry of Water Resources and at provincial level. And there's, I think, scope to support local NGOs active in water and environmental matters. I was tempted to suggest a high-level UK initiative to promote a comprehensive agreement between Iraq, Turkey and Iran over shared water resources, but I didn't recommend such initiative because I thought it would probably fall flat on its diplomatic face. I did suggest a couple of more modest endeavours in this area, which could be a dialogue between the UK and the Iraqi government about finding ways in which Iraq could best engage with its neighbours over shared water resources, and also training for Iraqi water negotiators should there seem to be a real prospect of negotiations with one or more of Iraq's riparians. Can I just say something about the recommendations or about the impact? Later, if you like.
Yeah, let's leave it to another round because I want to get Dr. Yasseen's take. Dr. Yasseen, if I may turn to you, you've just heard some recommendations for the UK government for how it can help Iraq. Would love to hear from you about the Iraqi government and its own policies regarding climate change and tackling the damage that climate change is having on Iraq. So, tfaddal.
Well, hello. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really sorry I'm not with you in London. This is a very personal issue to me because I started working for the Climate Change Secretariat 27 years ago. And in 27 years, we'll be in 2050, which is the horizon that most people look at when talking about the dire projections that will befall the region. So it really is very real to me. The problem with Iraq is that we are very, very late comers to this issue. Iraq only joined the Climate Change Convention, for example, in 2009, whereas it was put up for adoption already in 1992, and most of our neighboring countries adhered to it. Moreover, because of the way we were set up, and because, of course, of the impact of the governance that we had and in the international sanctions, we were very, very late in adopting measures that would have made the situation much, much better. And so, for example, the terrible oil situation that was described earlier prevails because during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and up to almost now, we're still pursuing practices that have been abandoned by all of our neighbors. For example, Saudi Arabia started capturing its methane to produce electricity with it already in the 1970s. We're still burning methane, as was expounded. But the positive thing is that there is a real realization on what the impact of climate change is going to have on Iraq. And so, just to give you an example, over the last 2 or 3 months, we've had 4 or 5 or even 6 conferences on climate change. And tomorrow I'm going to represent the Prime Minister at a conference looking at the role of women to address climate change. So it really is becoming part of the common culture. The problem is that we really don't understand what all of this means as yet. Like I said, we only adhered to the convention very, very late. The standard bearer for this work on climate change in Iraq is the Ministry of the Environment. But for an oil-producing country, we will be hit by climate change in two ways. First of all, we are, as was very, accurately described, we will be victims of climate change itself. Increased temperature, reduced water flows, sandstorms, desertification, what have you. But we will also be subjected to the indirect impacts of the world addressing climate change, which is the decarbonization of its industry. Now, Iraq is a country that is practically entirely dependent on oil exports. And so we really have to do things properly. We have to start working by diversifying our economy in order to be able precisely to do the changes that are required. Now, the positive thing is that right now Iraq has revenues that are quite considerable, and that we could put to bear on reinventing ourselves to become a country that is that can adapt and that resilient to climate change, which would require a whole series of actions. To me, for example, the one thing that we should do is to reinvent the entire agricultural system in Iraq. The problem, though, is that in Iraq, most of people look at the issue of climate change through a wrong perspective. We're all talking about the fact that we have reduced water flows. A lot of people assign it to climate change, but as was rightly pointed out, this is mostly due to the impact of upstream neighbors. And in fact, I want to point out that being a downstream country is quite common, and it's not a comfortable situation to be in. We are several countries in the world like this. Another example that I can mention is Egypt, and we see eye to eye on that with them on this. And in fact, sadly, there is no real international regime that covers this situation. The irony of this whole thing is that, the first international, so to speak, international treaty on water issues was developed in Iraq between two cities on the Tigris River to discuss about the proper distribution of their water rights. But like I said, there is great realization in the Iraqi government that this is an issue that we need to confront. Finally, the Ministry of Oil has begun to talk the talk, and not only that, to walk the walk. I think pretty soon we will be engaged in reducing methane flaring. Methane flaring is something that we need to do because flaring methane is burning money, essentially. And then we also have to, like I said earlier, adapt to climate change by becoming resilient. Now, that will require us to, like was said earlier, adopt new measures in terms of agriculture and in terms of water management. The Iraqis, by and large, are a very thrifty people. They don't waste things except for commodities that should be wasted. One is energy, and the other is water. And one measure that ought to be contemplated, for example, is to set a proper price for these commodities so that at least we have better use of this precious resource. Like I said, there is a great attention paid to this issue at the highest level. And I realize that it's going to be an extremely tough proposition to deal with. But, what choice do we have? I mean, we really have to develop ourselves in order to be able to resilient to climate change as it comes and it hits us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And on that note, I want to turn to Gleda. You've heard a lot about the problems, some recommendations for the UK government, some further challenges from the Iraqi side. So in terms of international or at least regional cooperation, The situation that Greg mentioned is, of course, very tough between, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. However, there is still something that can be done, surely, on the international or regional cooperation level.
Yeah, thank you, Lena, and thank you to all the speakers. You've kind of alleviated me from speaking about any of the problems that Iraq faces, which are extremely acute. But I want to talk a bit more about the opportunities that are there right now, because I think all the speakers have drawn attention to the fact that Iraq is not alone in these challenges. Environment and climate change, environmental stress and climate change have no respect for borders, and those challenges are really intimately connected with its neighbouring countries. I think there's an opportunity in terms of the political will that Dr. Farid has just talked about coming from Iraq, and I was surprised when I was in the country last March that there were 3 conferences that really where the Prime Minister attended and really emphasized the importance of working on climate change, both adaptation and mitigation in the country. So there is a shift there. The relative stability that's been there, needs to be capitalized on. I hope that it remains and becomes even more stable in spite of the tragedies taking place in the region. And then there's this opportunity to work with other neighbors, the GCC and Iran, as well as Turkey. There has been a move towards rapprochement and détente in the region since 2021. The Baghdad conference process really flags the interest of neighboring countries in the stability and development of Iraq, and that should remain, a shared interest, and that really includes stabilizing the environment and responding, building resilience to climate change. And then, in terms of internationally, there is a desire amongst donors, the UN, and a number of philanthropic entities to really shore up climate resilience and invest in adaptation in the region in various ways, and including initiatives regarding environment for peace and stability. So I think there are opportunities for partnerships there. Of course, there are many barriers to that. Zainab Shukr has written very eloquently about the institutional fragmentation and the lack of accountability in Iraq, which has inhibited a vision and an active strategy and implementation of those strategies towards climate change and the environment, and they are still really live and active problems. Renad, in the very beginning of this the conference today, flagged accountability, and I can't really stress that enough. The work that Greg and I did on cascading climate risks in the Middle East and North Africa region in 2022, I'll leave some copies of that report out if you're interested. Really flagged that. We heard from government officials, civil society activists, professors and academics at every turn that there was not accountability there was not the accountability in place to really reduce the vulnerabilities that are coming from water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, and building regulation as well. All those things are making countries more vulnerable to climate change. So I really want to stress that we're not passive. None of us, across the world, we're not passive recipients of climate change. There is opportunities to act because of the way we treat the environment, the way we build, the way we apply rule of law. So in terms of opportunities for cooperation, I kind of there are many, but I'll just flag one so that we can have more discussion. And it's one that I've just worked on an article with Adnan Tabatabai over there on regarding sand and dust storms, because that's a very tangible threat. In 2022, there were thousands hospitalized in Iraq from dust storms, but also in the wider region because they spread to Kuwait and other countries in the GCC and Iran. It's a shared threat throughout the region. It's a natural phenomenon, but it's been worsened by the degradation of land. So that has come about as a because of removal of vegetation, farm losses because of the conflict with Daesh, for instance, militarization since 2003, and lots of agricultural practices like burning crops and poor irrigation, of course. So those particles are being whipped up and taken not only to other parts of Iraq, but also to Kuwait, for instance, Qatar, UAE. So all those countries have an interest, actually, in investing in regeneration of ecosystems in Iraq, and that presents an amazing opportunity also to invest in rural sustainable livelihoods. There has been some really interesting examples. The Kuwait Fund for Arab Development and UN Habitat are investing in planting native species in a part of southern Iraq to reduce those dust storm effects. There are also examples of no-till agriculture using stubble as mulch, for instance, up in Nineveh and other northern provinces, which has helped to increase yields in the past. So I'll stop there. We can talk more about positive examples later, but they are out there. And if people, I would just stress again, accountability and cooperation are the only way forward, because otherwise, the whole region will be overwhelmed by what is coming in terms of climate change.
Thank you so much, Gleda. Dr. Yassin, if I may turn back to you. Speaking of cooperation, we have the COP28 conference happening at the end of this month. Many Arab countries did not really change much or promise much after the last COP conference. However, I'd be very interested to see where Iraq stands. Is there any opportunity at COP28 that Iraq can particularly take advantage of at the level of international cooperation, for example?
Yes, there is. You actually put your finger on it, Lina. At the United Nations General Assembly, the Prime Minister actually launched the idea that maybe countries around the Gulf could form a negotiating bloc to defend their interests and share resources to address this issue. And it makes perfect sense, because the areas surrounding the Gulf will, if projections prevail, be subjected to practically unlivable conditions. Many of the issues that were described earlier can only be addressed on a regional scale. For example, dust storms, heat waves need to be addressed, like I said, on a regional scale. But on the flip side of that is that measures that are positive in one country will also have positive effects on the other. So if we reforest in an area in Iraq, it'll have, like you said, positive impacts down in the Gulf. And so there is really a good arguments for us to put our act together and work together to put our views forward. And it makes sense, because Iraq is a small country, as are all the countries surrounding the Gulf. And in negotiations like these, where you have 200 countries pushing back and forth, the only way to get yourself heard is to be part of a powerful, well-coordinated coalition that pushes your ideas forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to flip it now and talk about conflict. And I want to talk to Dr. Al-Hassan about this, because if we don't solve the problem, then we're opening the possibility of further conflict. And I know this is something that you've been also looking at. So over to you.
أنا أعتقد أن التغير المناخي في العراق يغذي الصراعات وعدم الاستقرار في المجتمع العراقي. وأستطيع أنه أضرب لكم 3 أمثلة بهذا الخصوص. أولاً، ندرة المياه خصوصاً في مناطق جنوبي العراق هي تعمل على خلق تنازع ما بين المزارعين، تنازعهم على الحصص المائية طبعاً. وهنالك كثير من الأنباء حول حصول مشاجرات وتنازعات ما بين المزارعين في الأراضي الزراعية المتاخمة للحدود الإدارية لمحافظات جنوبي العراق. فمثلا نجد صراعا يحدث ما بين مزارعي البصرة مع مزارعي ميسان، أو مع مزارعي البصرة مع مزارعي ذي قار، وذي قار مع ميسان، والمثنى مع الديوانية، والديوانية مع الكوت، وهكذا. في هذا الخصوص أستطيع أن أحيلكم إلى دراسة قيمة كتبها الدكتور ماكس كيلتون في هذا المجال، تستطيعون أن تجدون فيها كثير من التفاصيل في هذا الموضوع. أيضا النقطة الثانية، تراجع مساحة المسطحات المائية في العراق في الحقيقة ممكن أنه يولد لنا صراعات مسلحة ما بين القبائل، ولدينا بعض الأمثلة على ذلك. فمثلا في مناطق الهامشية لأهوار الشبايش هنالك قبيلتان تتصارعان باشتباكات مسلحة نتيجة لانحسار المياه عن الأهوار، فحينما تنحسر المياه عن الأهوار تندفع القبيلة الأخرى إلى الأراضي التي جفت عنها من أجل استغلالها لموارد أخرى، وهكذا تصطدم مع القبيلة التي تعتمد على مياه الأهوار. هنالك أيضا اشتباكات متقطعة تحدث ما بين الفينة والفينة في أهوار شرق الحمار على سبيل المثال. النقطة الثالثة في الحقيقة التي أود أن أركز عليها، جفاف المسطحات المائية في جنوبي العراق بات يعمل على دفع حركة نزوح بيئي غير مسبوقة. هنالك كثير من النازحين الذين تركوا مناطقهم بعد أن جفت عنها المياه واتجهوا نحو المدن. وزارة التخطيط العراقية صرحت مؤخرا بأنه نسبة السكان الحضر في العراق حاليا 70%، فيما تقلصت نسبة السكان الريف إلى 30%. ووافتنا الأنباء أيضا بأنه حوالي 10,000 أسرة في محافظات البصرة وذي قار وميسان قد نزحوا بسبب التغير المناخي. وأنا هنا أود أن أستغل هذه المناسبة لأوجه تحذيرا بأنه كرة الثلج هذه إذا ما استمرت بالتدحرج واستمر النزوح البيئي نحو المدن العراقية فإن هذه المدن سوف تتورم. لدينا مثال واضح على ذلك في البصرة التي تضخم عدد سكانها بشكل غير طبيعي نتيجة للهجرة الوافدة إليها من المناطق الريفية. وأعتقد أنه هذه الهجرة أو النزوح البيئي المحلي سوف يتحول إلى هجرة إلى خارج العراق، ممكن حتى أنه تصل إلى أوروبا، لأنه سكان الريف يضغطون على الخدمات وعلى فرص العمل الموجودة في المدن، وهذا لا يجعل أنه سكان المدن أو الشباب اللي موجودين في المدن أصلا يستطيعون أن يجدوا فرصا عمل لها، فيفكرون في الهجرة إلى حتى خارج العراق. لدينا كثير من المؤشرات المقلقة في هذا الصدد.
Gleda, if I can turn to you just for a comment on the issue of agriculture, because we've just heard from Dr. Al-Hassan, there's a real challenge there. But at the same time, you know, perhaps moving away from oil and gas and focusing on agriculture could be a positive step. So I just wanted your comment on how what Iraq can do to kind of balance out this, you know, the opportunities and challenges regarding agriculture.
That's a question to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just in terms of the, I mean, the high level of dependence on oil and gas is really worrying for Iraq in many ways, because I mean, I think the current budget is based on around $70 per barrel. That may well go down and will go down at some point in the future. At the moment, Iraq already has had several food crises, and the last one in 2022 has been masked by the higher global oil prices. It was able to increase subsidies and increase the price that it paid to farmers for wheat. But meanwhile, while other countries are also struck by drought, so that the countries sending food to Iraq will be hit by drought in future. Those prices are likely to rise internationally. That the population is growing in Iraq. If nothing is done with the local agriculture, then those yields will go down, and there you have one of the biggest drivers for unrest and instability in a country. So it's absolutely essential that real thought goes into reforming the whole of the agricultural system, including the way things are priced. As Dr. Faridas mentioned, the way that water is managed. But within that, as you say, there is this great opportunity. Iraq is the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent. It still has more water resources than other countries downstream. So there is this opportunity to revive them through reviving ecosystems. I just want to draw attention really to some great work that's being done by civil society actors in Iraq, which have come. Those actors are under pressure, they're under stress for various reasons. They cannot operate in a free way anymore. But some of those have come up with amazing work with riverine communities to revive local ecosystems. They also worked with the last government on the Mesopotamian Revitalization Initiative, which provides a framework, a foundation for reducing oil and gas dependence and growing other sectors of the economy while reviving the natural fertility of the land. So there are opportunities there if people can come together and cooperate.
Thank you. And Greg, I want to turn back to you because you had recommendations to share, and now's your chance to do that before we open the floor to people online and in the room for questions. So, Greg.
Yeah, well, as I said, just in very summary form, I kept my recommendations modest, and they were addressed to the FCDO, not to the government of Iraq, because the government of Iraq has had plenty of reports that have made lots of recommendations, but have implemented hardly any of them. So I wanted to propose interventions by the FCDO that could have a reasonable chance of success and could pass the accountability test. And this is very important for donor governments. And the level of corruption in Iraq is such that a lot of things are simply not something His Majesty's government should get involved in. But I think there are things that could be done at a local scale directly with farmers or via NGOs to modernize their irrigation methods, to help them switch from rice to other crops such as vegetables in the vulnerable southern governorates. And the groundwater thing, I think, has a lot of potential. Groundwater is a smallish part of the Iraqi water budget, but it's an important buffer in times of low flow. And the great thing about groundwater is that you can now monitor it from space. So you don't have to be out in the field checking level of water in wells and so on. And there's this question of improving the ability of officials, both in the Ministry of Water Resources at a provincial level and in the Ministry of Agriculture. Both of these ministries, despite the importance of water and of agriculture, seem to be the Cinderellas of the Iraqi political system. People are not interested in them so much. The Ministry of Water Resources gets 1% of the overall national budget. I assume the reason is that nobody can make any money out of them. I'm sorry to be so cynical. I have a hard-earned reputation for cynicism that I'm keen to maintain. Now, I just wanted to say you know, if you're a consultant, you produce a report, okay, you get paid, that's very nice, but you want to know that it's had some impact. So I asked our embassy in Baghdad to tell me what impact it had had. They say it's informed UK policy discussions on the subject. For example, the recommendations were considered as the embassy's climate and environment strategy was reviewed. The report has also helped to confirm the validity of the embassy's approach to program work. For example, the farmer schools in northern Iraq, which are run by the UNDP and funded by the UK and Iraq. And the UK also supports training for water negotiators as part of a wider UNDP project, and I just hope there'll be some negotiating to be done in the not too distant future in which they can deploy their skills. Can I also mention, because it'll be of interest, I think, to people in this session, the FCDO has also funded a study on the availability of data on surface water, that's rivers, lakes, marshes, etc., which has just been published online. It was produced by Professor Michael Mason and a team of researchers at the LSE's Middle East Centre, and it's a fine and valuable piece of work and well worth reading. And if you go to LSE Research online, you'll find this study and indeed my own report.
Thank you.
It's a commercial break over.
Yeah, no, that's a well-earned break, because at least it's not based on on nothing. It's based on actual research. It's good for people to know where the resources are, and in fact that's something that you know, Dr. Yassin was talking about in the beginning, about how much is not yet known in Iraq. So the more information, the better. So on that note, I'd like to open it for questions. There's a couple of questions online who I've already received. Because Dr. Yassin will have to leave us soon, I'm going to say, if you have a question for Dr. Yassin, let me know now, and I'll go for, you know, for the other questions later. So for now, I'm just taking a question or two for Dr. Yassin, and I assume someone's there with a microphone. Yes, so let's start with yourself. It's this way. Second row from the front on this side. Yeah. And please introduce yourself.
Hello, this is Najat. I'm doing Masters in Political Violence at COS University of London. My question for Ustad Farid is, since we've heard that there are different challenges facing the Iraqi coexistence because of climate actions, what are the government's plan in reducing the waste of water, like, for example, the wastewater? And also, we know in Iraq there are several of fishing farms, illegal fishing farms, are laying on the rivers of Euphrates and Tigris. So what are the plans of the government to resolve these issues and also to reduce the violence that's happening in the country? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Yassin, if it's okay with you, I'm going to take all the questions for you, and then it's up to you to decide how to respond before you have to go. Second question is here at the front. And just goes without saying, yes, you're next. Please keep your questions very brief. Sorry. Yeah.
مداخلة دقيقة واحدة ممكن؟ إلى علاقة
بسرعة.
شكرا جزيلا. Dr. Jihan Baban, the CEO of the Iraqi Environment and Health Society UK. I'm a renewable energy engineer and chartered environmentalist. Obviously, in preparation for COP28, there are evidence that this taking more seriously by the government of Iraq and an increased collaboration between ministerials to address this very serious problems we are facing in Iraq for climate change and the environmental degradation. My observation, which is not mentioned by the panels, which I really give me 1 minute to say, now, the Iraqi government has to address this issue on 3 fronts. The first one.
Then I'm going to send this. I'm sorry. Ask your question now, otherwise I'm going to have to move to the next one. I'm really sorry.
My question is for the panels, including Dr. Yassin. There are a long list of things which we need to consider, including the implementation of air law, the law which is a bill which covers the environmental and climate change and air pollution. We have submitted this in 2019 to the government. Now the question is, what are the 3 practical priorities you would advise the Mr. Sudani government to adapt and mitigate climate change? And that's it.
Brilliant.
Quick.
Thank you so much. I know that Dr. Yassin has to go. That's why I'm in a rush. So, Dr. Yassin, before you have to leave us, over to you.
So this is a very rich discussion, and I'm very grateful that you've invited me to it. And there you have a lot of resources sitting next to you, and these are people I'd like to stay in touch with. The issue that was raised first was the waste of water because of fish farms. Serious issue. It's led to conflict. And in fact, I can tell you that I was at a session that included the Minister of Water Resources, who was in discussions with the federal police to try to implement and to impose the restrictions that need to be applied. This is something that will happen. It's been let go for too long, but the consequences are too serious, and the government will do what it needs to do on that. On one of your the second question I asked about, she's an environmental engineer. Well, I'd like to tell you that one of the things that we're doing in Iraq is trying to bring in new technologies to address climate change and the situation we're in. One really interesting project, which hadn't been considered at all in Iraq previously, was to consider the installation of wind power to generate electricity in Iraq. A lot of people thought that there was no wind power in Iraq. In fact, there is in insufficient quantities, particularly in Basra. And so I think that's one thing that we need to do. The recommendation that I would have to the Iraqi government, and that's something that it is working very seriously on, is to stop flaring. Stop flaring is flaring is a waste of money, waste of resources. It hurts people, it poisons people, and so that is something that I think is taken seriously. And the really interesting thing about it is that it has the plans that the government has put in have timelines which will be enforced. One final comment, if I could. We really suffer from not knowing the lay of the land. Countries like the United Kingdom, earlier the Netherlands was mentioned, they have resources in space that could provide us with really helpful information on water content, water flow, quality of water, emissions. These are things that we really need to be able to plan ahead. My final thought, and I want it to be a positive one, bear in mind that agriculture was invented in Iraq. And the thing is that in order for us to continue to be around the two rivers, is for us to reinvent agriculture in Iraq. And here I think there are countries that we could work with more closely than others. These are countries that have thrived in much more arid conditions than we've had to date. I can mention Australia, I can mention parts of the United States. Solutions do exist, and we just need to be able to implement them appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you a follow-up question from someone online called Mercedes McKay on flaring? The question is, do you believe that Iraq will manage to stop flaring gas by 2030? So basically, is there a timeline, a realistic one?
Look, I got wrapped on the fingers because I urged our oil minister to agree to be part of the methane pledge, which aims to reduce our methane flaring by 30% by 2030. You have no idea how much money we're burning through flaring, and so there is every reason for us to stop it.
Okay, thank you. Best of luck with that, and thank you so much for joining us. And I know you said you have to leave early.
I have 3 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, you have 3 minutes. Oh, 3 minutes. Okay. Does anyone want to ask a pressing question? We have one person in the room. Go ahead.
Hi, former OECD, former FCO, studying at SARS. worked on climate finance. What prospect is there for you getting sizable amounts of climate finance to help, for example, dealing with the flaring, for adaptation, and maybe even for loss and damage now?
Okay, over to you, Dr.
Excellent question. So this is a very important topic. The Ministry of Environment is interested in this. The Ministry of Oil has launched a project on this. We are getting all sorts of proposals from oil companies willing to capture our flared gas and only pay themselves off the emissions credits. So there is great interest in this. The real problem, though, is that in Iraq, I think we can only proceed once we have the proper legislation in place. For those that are interested, there's a movie called Carbon with an E at the end, talks about a major fraud case where some people built the EU for several $billion because of emissions credits. And so this is not a situation we'd like to be in. So I think the emphasis will be on proper oversight and legislation first.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I can take questions for everyone else on the panel. And
can I just say one thing?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really grateful to you for hosting this. And I would very much like to stay in touch with the participants in this panel. Thank you. And my final point is that I am full of admiration for our environmental activists. They're real heroes. I mean it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, question.
I should leave now. Bye-bye.
I mean, I was just told you have to leave early, so I tried to make it easy. Thank you so much. Questions from the audience. So we have one. I'm going to take three at a time. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Hello. Yep. My name is Shad. I'm a student at Royal Holloway, University of London. So dams have been mentioned by the panel. I'm going to keep it very short and direct. Can we say then that water is being used as a geopolitical tool or as a weapon? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question behind you.
Hi, I'm Raza Saleh from Amnesty International. My question is for Shukr al-Hassan. You mentioned there's climate-induced displacement, and I wanted to know if you have monitored and observed any negative coping mechanisms for the displaced population, and if so, what would be your recommendation for addressing those?
Thank you. Yeah.
Keeping with the human rights, I'm Sarah Sanvar from Human Rights Watch. And my question is about the reliance on fossil fuels as a source of government revenue. And obviously, there's a lot of people that stand to benefit from the status quo, both elites, but also the millions and millions of people that are on the public sector payroll who receive their salaries from fossil fuel revenues. So what advice would you give the Iraqi government in terms of sequencing a green transition in a way that can balance the need for social stability, economic stability, and environmental protection? Thank you.
Thank you so much. 3 really excellent questions. One is addressed to yourself. The others are open. Shall we start with the one addressed to you? Yes. And you can answer any of the others as well.
Yes. فيما يتعلق بمسألة النزوح المناخي يعني أنا لاحظت بأنه المدن العراقية بدأت تستقبل أعداد كبيرة من ناس كانوا يمارسون رعي الحيوانات ويتعاملون مع البيئات المائية اللي كانت بيهم، لكن نتيجة للتأثيرات التغير المناخي اللي حصلت في مناطقهم اضطروا إلى النزوح إلى هذه المدن. في الحقيقة حدود المدن هي مفتوحة لهم، وللأسف لن تتخذ الحكومة العراقية إجراءات فاعلة لمنع هذا النزوح، لأنها لم توفر لهم فرص معيشة أو مساعدات تجعلهم يستطيعون البقاء في أماكنهم.
بعتقد السؤال هو كان هل في دراسات وثقت الأعداد النازحين أو يعني
لا توجد هنالك دراسات دقيقة في هذا الموضوع، ولذلك أنا أدعو من خلال تشاثم هاوس إلى أنه نبحث في هذا الموضوع أكثر وأكثر. هنالك فقط إحصائية خرجت عن وزارة التخطيط العراقية مؤخرا ذكرت فيها أنه 10,000 أسرة نزحت إلى المدن العراقية لأسباب تتعلق بالتغير المناخي. نعم.
Greg and Gleda, there's two questions on weaponization and on what to do about all those people who make a living out of the fossil fuel industry. I don't know if you'd like to tackle one or two.
Do you want to do water weaponization and I'll do the fossil fuels?
Well, I'd like to have a go at that interesting question about dams as a geopolitical weapon. My answer, the short answer to that is no, I don't think so. I think in both the case of Iraq, of Turkey and Iran, they're doing what they want to do with very little regard to the interests of Iraq, but this is not for reasons of geopolitical leverage. It's simply because they want to make use of those water resources and they don't want to be constrained in doing so. As for Iran, it doesn't need to use dams to influence decision-making in Baghdad. It's got plenty of levers it can pull. It's just simply taking the water it thinks it needs, and if there's nothing left for Iraq, well, too bad. Turkey is a different case. Turkish water diplomacy is quite smart. Turkey will say, let's talk about an agreement on water. In order to make this a good agreement, we need to respect the following principles. One of those is, there's equitable and reasonable use of water, there's no significant harm. These are all in the UN 1997 convention. They add an optimum use. And optimum use means that you use the water in the way that Turkey thinks is right. And they make a good case. But the premises on which they're offering to talk are not acceptable to Iraq. I think this is a mistake on Iraq's part, but it's not for me perhaps to tell the government of Iraq what to do, but I think saying for the government of Iraq to say, no, we need an agreement which gives us X billion cubic meters of water a year in the Tigris and the Euphrates, this is not going to happen. They've lost that. The only thing that you could make an agreement on now is how Turkey operates its dams. And that agreement it's a win-win solution. If you store water in reservoirs in Turkey, the evaporation losses are much smaller than they are in Iraq. Iraq could offer something in exchange. It could offer cut-price energy. There is a win-win solution, and I'm not saying anything original. This idea has been put forward by Azam Al-Wash previously. It makes good sense, but for whatever reason, that proposal has not gained traction. But I think it's an excellent idea, and there's no obvious rational reason why it shouldn't be pursued.
Thank you. Gleda.
So just on use of water as a weapon, I just wanted to draw attention to, of course, Daesh did do that when it was controlling various areas of the river and the Fallujah Dam in particular. And that could happen again, we hope not. But on the question of the reducing dependence on fossil fuels, which is a really excellent and prescient question, there's a few things that I'd like to mention. First of all, there is a foundation to build on in terms of a vision in Iraq. There was a white paper produced a few years ago, to which I know some people in this room contributed to, which talked about that, which laid out some plans for reducing that dependence and for invigorating the private sector in Iraq, which is essential. There is the Mesopotamian Revitalization Initiative, which I mentioned before, which you can find online as a guiding vision, which needs practical action plans for each of the sectors it identifies to be drawn up. There's the balance of trade question that I mentioned earlier, so where Iraq is working towards in terms of becoming much less dependent on exports in certain areas, but also optimizing interregional trade, which it could do. I think it's important to mention in terms of the budget constraints in the private sector that I think it's about a quarter of the budget goes on civil service wages in a very inflated government service. That really needs attention because it's not drawing graduates into the right spaces if you want to relieve some of the budget of those constraints. And then in terms of the actual fossil fuel sector, there's a number of options for help out there, particularly in reducing methane, as have been mentioned, the World Bank, the Methane Hub, the pledge. And I really hope that all help is extended to Iraq in doing this in terms of finding the right incentives for companies, finding putting in place the regulation, the legislation necessary to drive that forward. And just to really emphasize it, I mean, methane is 25 times more potent as a climate forcer than carbon dioxide, although it's more short-lived. So in the near term, it's really essential that that's brought down for global reasons as well as local reasons. Of course, it's leading to extreme health problems as well. The amount that Iraq flares is 17 to 18 billion cubic meters per year. That's the same amount of LNG that Europe imported from Russia last year. It's a similar amount to what was used in Belgium, for instance. It's a huge, huge amount. And finally, I want to mention that there are opportunities now. I mean, there's the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. There's a number of countries around the world willing to partner with states in thinking about what their economic future looks like beyond oil and gas, or with a much lower proportion of that revenue. So I think there's help available out there. Again, it does depend on inter-ministry cooperation forming around a vision.
Thank you so much, Cleda, and thank you to all speakers and all the really great questions today, and to the audience online. Sorry, I know a lot of people have questions, but we don't have time. We've run out of time. So I'm afraid we have to wrap up, but that means we need to keep talking about this issue. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panel.